In the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Millions of German soldiers crossed the Soviet border, expecting another swift and decisive victory, just as they had achieved in France and Poland. Their armored divisions, made up of Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, had dominated every battlefield they entered. Confidence was high, and few in the Wehrmacht believed that the Red Army possessed anything capable of stopping them. That belief began to crumble only weeks into the campaign. As German spearheads pushed deeper into Soviet territory, frontline commanders started to report encounters with a new kind of Soviet tank. It was unlike anything they had seen before, faster, stronger, and more deadly. The German anti-tank weapons that had so easily destroyed earlier Soviet models were now failing against this machine. Shells bounced harmlessly off its angled armor, and its gun could destroy German tanks at distances far beyond what the Germans could respond to. This new tank was the T-34, and its sudden appearance on the battlefield came as a complete shock to the invading forces. The T-34's revolutionary design combined features rarely seen together at the time. Its sloped armor increased effective protection without adding unnecessary weight. Its powerful 76.2mm gun could penetrate German armor easily, while its wide tracks gave it superior mobility across mud, snow, and rough terrain conditions that often immobilized German vehicles. German tank crews, accustomed to easy victories, were stunned to find themselves outmatched. Their shots failed to penetrate the T-34's armor, while the Soviet crews, often inexperienced but determined, struck back with devastating effect. Reports of this new tank reached high command, and even experienced officers like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth acknowledged that the T-34 represented a new standard in tank warfare. The psychological impact was as great as the physical one. German troops who had believed in the superiority of their equipment suddenly realized that the Soviet Union possessed a weapon not only equal, but in many ways superior to their own. The T-34 had arrived at a critical moment when the Red Army seemed to be collapsing under the German advance, and it proved that the Soviet Union had the industrial and technological strength to fight back. From that moment, the Eastern Front would never be the same. The Germans were forced to rethink their tank designs, their tactics, and even their confidence in victory. The T-34 had changed the rules of the game. The story of the T-34 began years before the German invasion, in a Soviet Union determined to modernize its armed forces. During the 1930s, the Red Army's armored corps relied heavily on light tanks, such as the BT series, which were fast but poorly protected. Soviet military engineers, observing the rapid evolution of armored warfare in Europe, understood that the next war would demand something far more capable, a tank that could move quickly, strike hard, and survive the enemy's firepower. In 1937, at the Kharkiv locomotive plant, a group of engineers led by Mikhail Kushkin and Alexander Morozov began developing what would become the T-34. Their task was ambitious: to design a new medium tank that combined the mobility of the BT series with the firepower and armor of a heavy tank. This concept was revolutionary at the time. Most nations separated their tanks into light, medium, and heavy categories, each fulfilling a specific role. The Soviets aimed to create one design capable of doing it all. Kushkin's team focused on three key principles: speed, protection, and firepower. They gave the new tank sloped armor, an innovation that increased the chance of deflecting incoming rounds while keeping the armor relatively thin and light. They equipped it with a 76.2mm L-11 gun, powerful enough to defeat any tank in the world when the design was finalized to ensure mobility across the vast and harsh landscapes of the Soviet Union. The engineers installed wide tracks and a robust suspension system, allowing the T-34 to traverse mud, snow, and uneven ground that would trap most vehicles. The early prototypes, the A-20 and A-32, were tested in extreme conditions, from the freezing cold of northern Russia to the scorching heat of Central Asia. Koshkin famously drove one prototype from Kharkiv to Moscow, a journey of more than 1,800 kilometers, to prove its reliability to skeptical military officials. The tank survived the grueling trip, convincing Soviet leaders that it could withstand the challenges of wartime service. In 1940, the design was officially approved, and production began at several factories across the Soviet Union. Just a year later, when Germany invaded, the T-34 was still relatively new, with only a few hundred units in service. Yet even in these small numbers, its impact on the battlefield was immediate and profound. The Germans quickly realized that they faced a tank superior to anything in their arsenal. The T-34 was not perfect. It suffered from mechanical issues, cramped interiors, and unreliable communication systems. But its fundamental design was decades ahead of its time. It represented a new philosophy of armored warfare, that a tank should be simple, rugged, and adaptable, able to be produced in vast numbers under the pressures of total war. As the T-34 rolled out of Soviet factories in increasing quantities, it became not just a weapon, but a symbol, a machine that embodied the resilience and industrial strength of the Soviet Union. It would soon face its greatest test, surviving the brutal battles of 1942, when the war on the Eastern Front reached its darkest and most decisive moment. When the T-34 first appeared in combat during the summer of 1941, its presence was limited but unforgettable. On the wide plains of Ukraine and the forests of Belarus, German soldiers encountered a tank they could neither outgun nor outrun. Though the Red Army was unprepared for the scale of the German invasion, and many Soviet units collapsed under the onslaught, the T-34 showed flashes of what it could achieve when used effectively. Reports from German armored divisions described engagements where entire anti-tank units failed to stop even a handful of their 37mm and early 50mm anti-tank guns, which had easily destroyed French and British armor in previous campaigns, were almost useless against the Soviet tank sloped armor. Only heavy artillery or concentrated fire from short distances had a chance of penetrating its hull. In some cases, German crews were forced to call in dive bombers or heavy howitzers to deal with a single T-34 blocking their advance. Despite these strengths, the early months of combat were disastrous for the Red Army. Many T-34s were lost not to enemy fire but to poor logistics, lack of fuel, or mechanical breakdowns. The crews were often hastily trained, and Soviet command structure at the time was rigid and inexperienced. Still, even amid retreat and chaos, the T-34 stood out as a weapon that could challenge the German blitzkrieg. By 1942, as Soviet factories relocated eastward and production increased, thousands of T-34s began rolling off the assembly line. These tanks became the backbone of the Soviet counteroffensives. They were deployed in larger formations, coordinated with infantry and artillery, gradually shaping a new approach to armored warfare. The Red Army learned from its early mistakes, emphasizing mobility, mass, and aggressive tactics rather than static defense. One of the most remarkable features of the T-34 was its adaptability. While German engineers constantly refined complex and expensive designs like the Tiger and Panther, the T-34 was built to be simple, easy to produce, and quick to repair. Crews could replace damaged parts with minimal tools, and new versions could be assembled under harsh wartime conditions. The simplicity of its design meant that even factories deep in Siberia, operating under primitive conditions, could continue production. The T-34 soon became a symbol of Soviet resistance. It appeared on every front, from the frozen fields near Leningrad to the vast steppes of Stalingrad and Kursk. Its mobility allowed Soviet forces to execute deep armored thrusts, cutting through German lines and disrupting supply routes. The Germans, who had once dominated the battlefield with superior tactics, now found themselves facing waves of tanks that could match or surpass their own. By late 1942, the tide of war began to shift. The T-34's growing numbers and effectiveness helped the Red Army halt the German advance and prepare for counteroffensives that would eventually push the Wehrmacht back. The Battle of Moscow, the defense of Stalingrad, and the later offensive at Kursk all showed the decisive role that Soviet armor would play in reclaiming the initiative. The T-34 had gone from a surprise weapon to the beating heart of the Soviet war machine. It was not just a tank, it was the embodiment of a nation's will to survive and fight back. And as the Germans struggled to adapt, they were forced to design new tanks of their own to meet the challenge, leading to an intense technological arms race on the Eastern Front. The arrival of the T-34 on the Eastern Front forced Germany to confront an uncomfortable truth. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht faced a tank that outclassed its own designs in armor, firepower, and mobility. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, which had dominated Europe in 1939 and 1940, were suddenly obsolete. German crews were shocked by how easily the T-34 shrugged off their shells while returning fire with deadly accuracy. Reports from the front described the Soviet tank as a masterpiece of design, and even Adolf Hitler took personal interest in understanding how such a machine had been created. The German High Command realized that to regain superiority, they would need entirely new tanks. This decision marked the beginning of an intense and costly rearmament effort, one that would produce two of the most famous armored vehicles of the war, the Panther and the Tiger. Development of the Panther began after engineers studied captured teeth. They were impressed by the Soviet tanks' sloped armor, which provided superior protection without excessive weight, and they incorporated the same concept into the new German design. The Panther featured thick, angled armor, a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of destroying a T-34 at long range, and advanced optics that gave German crews excellent accuracy. In theory, it was the perfect balance between firepower, protection, and mobility, a direct answer to the Soviet threat. At the same time, another project was underway to create a heavy tank capable of total battlefield dominance, the Tiger I. Unlike the Panther, which sought to combine mobility and power, the Tiger focused on sheer strength. It carried the formidable 88mm gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft use, and could destroy a T-34 before the Soviet tank could even fire back. The Tiger's armor was nearly impenetrable to most Soviet weapons, making it one of the most feared machines of the war. However, these advancements came at a high cost. Both the Panther and the Tiger were complex, expensive, and time-consuming to build. Their mechanical reliability was poor, especially in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. Mud, snow, and long supply lines often left them immobilized or abandoned. A single Tiger took as many resources to produce as several T-34s, and Germany simply couldn't keep up with the Soviet Union's growing industrial output. The T-34's greatest strength was its simplicity. While German engineers aimed for technical perfection, Soviet designers focused on practicality and production efficiency. As a result, by the time a few hundred Tigers reached the front, the Red Army already fielded thousands of The Soviet Union's ability to repair, replace, and deploy tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them gradually eroded the Wehrmacht's armored advantage. German soldiers respected the T-34, even as they fielded superior machines on paper. The Soviet tank's rugged reliability meant it was always present in overwhelming numbers, advancing relentlessly through mud, snow, and wreckage. Its mechanical toughness contrasted sharply with the delicate precision of German design. By 1943, the new German tanks had entered service in large numbers, but they could not reverse the course of the war. Instead, the conflict became a contest between quality and quantity, between the technological sophistication of the Germans and the mass production efficiency of the Soviets. The stage was set for one of the largest and most decisive tank battles in history, a confrontation that would determine which philosophy truly ruled the battlefield. By the summer of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had reached a turning point. The German advance had stalled after the devastating defeat at Stalingrad, and the Red Army was preparing for a major counteroffensive. Both sides knew that the next great battle would determine the future of the war in the East. That battle came at Kursk, where German and Soviet forces gathered in the largest concentration of armor ever seen in history. The Germans launched Operation Citadel in July 1943, their last major attempt to regain the initiative. The plan was simple but risky. Attack the Kursk salient from both north and south, encircle the Soviet forces, and destroy them before they could strike back. To achieve this, Germany deployed its newest and most advanced tanks, the Panther, the Tiger Wine, and the Ferdinand tank destroyer, each designed to outgun and outlast the T-34. The Germans believed that their superior technology would guarantee victory. But the Soviets were ready. Thanks to extensive intelligence and reconnaissance, they knew exactly where and when the German offensive would begin. For months, the Red Army had prepared a vast defensive network, thousands of kilometers of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank positions. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers and over 3,000 T-34s waited for the assault. When the German attack began on July 5, it immediately ran into fierce resistance. The Panther tanks, rushed into battle before their mechanical issues were solved, suffered from frequent breakdowns. Many never reached the front lines. Those that did found themselves trapped in dense minefields and under heavy Soviet artillery fire. The T-34s, though technically inferior in some aspects, were more reliable and easier to maneuver. They swarmed the battlefield in great numbers, striking from multiple directions and overwhelming isolated German units. The most famous engagement of the battle took place near the village of Prokhorovka, where hundreds of Soviet and German tanks clashed in close combat. The T-34s advanced fearlessly, often engaging at point-blank range to negate the long-range advantage of the German guns. The scene was chaotic and brutal. Machines colliding, shells ricocheting, and smoke covering the battlefield. While the Germans destroyed many Soviet tanks, the Red Army's relentless counterattacks prevented them from breaking through. By mid-July, Operation Citadel had failed. The Germans had lost hundreds of tanks, many of them irreplaceable, while the Soviets still had reserves to spare. The T-34 once again proved its worth, not because it was the most powerful tank on the field, but because it was durable, mobile, and could be produced in overwhelming numbers. Its simple design allowed Soviet crews to repair damaged vehicles quickly and return them to combat, while the Germans struggled to maintain their sophisticated machines. Kursk marked the end of German offensive operations in the east. From that moment on, the Red Army seized the initiative and began pushing westward. The T-34 led the charge, rolling across liberated towns and villages, becoming a symbol of Soviet resurgence. The psychological impact of the battle was enormous. German commanders realized that they could no longer win a war of attrition against an enemy that could replace its losses faster than they could inflict them. The Battle of Kursk was more than a military confrontation. It was the defining moment when the balance of power on the Eastern Front shifted permanently in favor of the Soviet Union. The T-34 stood at the center of that transformation, a tank that embodied the strength, endurance, and adaptability of the nation that built it. The T-34's success on the battlefield was not just the result of clever engineering. It was a triumph of industrial willpower. Behind every tank that rolled into battle stood an enormous network of factories, workers, and engineers who transformed the Soviet Union into one of the greatest manufacturing powers of the 20th century. The ability to produce the T-34 in vast numbers, even under the most desperate wartime conditions, became one of the key reasons the Red Army was able to turn the tide of the war. When Germany invaded in 1941, many of the Soviet Union's largest industrial centers were located in the West, within reach of the advancing Wehrmacht. Entire factories, including those producing the T-34, were dismantled piece by piece and transported thousands of kilometers east to the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. This relocation, one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in history, was carried out under constant threat of enemy attack and in the harshest conditions imaginable. By late 1942, dozens of new factories were operational, many of them working around the clock. The Soviet industrial strategy was based on simplicity, standardization, and speed. The T-34 was designed from the start to be easy to build and repair, and this philosophy paid off. Each year, production became faster and more efficient. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union produced over 57,000 T-34s, far surpassing Germany's combined output of all tank models. The people behind this effort were as vital as the machines themselves. Factory workers, many of them women, teenagers, and elderly citizens, labored long hours in freezing workshops with limited food and supplies. Yet their dedication never wavered. Every tank that left the assembly line was a message of defiance to the invader. Some factories painted slogans like "For the Motherland" or "For Stalingrad" on the armor plates before shipment to the front. Soviet engineers also refined the T-34's design during the war. The original model, armed with a 76.2mm gun, was upgraded in 1943 to the T-34-85, featuring a more powerful 85mm cannon and a larger three-man turret. This version allowed for better crew coordination and improved the tank's ability to confront newer German designs, like the Panther and Tiger. Despite these enhancements, the T-34 remained relatively easy to produce, ensuring that Soviet factories could keep pace with the demands of a global conflict. The contrast between Soviet and German production philosophies was striking. Germany focused on precision and quality, producing tanks that were technologically advanced but slow and expensive to manufacture. The Soviet Union focused on quantity and practicality, producing simpler machines that could be built in huge numbers and repaired quickly in the field. In the end, it was this approach that overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. The T-34 became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of collective determination. Each tank represented the combined effort of thousands of workers and soldiers, united by a single goal: to defend their homeland. Its widespread availability ensured that Soviet armored divisions could attack continuously, keeping constant pressure on the German army. By 1944, the Soviet Union's industrial machine was operating at full strength, and the Red Army was advancing west on all fronts. From the ruins of Stalingrad to the outskirts of Berlin, the T-34 was at the forefront, leading the offensive that would ultimately bring down the Third Reich. By 1943, as the Red Army regained momentum on the Eastern Front, a new challenge emerged. The German army had introduced the Panther and Tiger tanks, machines with superior firepower and thick armor that could destroy the earlier T-34-76 from long distances. Although the Soviets had the advantage in numbers, the balance of power in tank duels began to shift again. The Red Army needed an upgrade to keep its most famous weapon competitive. The result was the T-34-85, an improved version that would become the definitive model of the war. The main problem with the original T-34 was its 76.2mm gun, which struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of the new German tanks. Soviet engineers recognized that the only solution was to mount a more powerful weapon. After several experiments, they selected the 85mm Zeiss S-53 gun, capable of piercing a Panther's armor at reasonable combat ranges. To accommodate this larger cannon, the T-34's turret had to be completely redesigned. The new three-man turret was one of the most significant improvements. Earlier T-34 models required the tank commander to also act as the gunner, making combat coordination extremely difficult. The T-34-85 added a dedicated gunner and loader, allowing the commander to focus on directing the crew and spotting targets. This change dramatically improved battlefield efficiency and response time. The updated turret was also roomier and provided better visibility, thanks to improved optics and a cupola with vision block. The hull and suspension remained largely the same. As the existing design was already proven and efficient, the combination of the new gun, improved turret layout, and existing mobility created a balanced and highly effective fighting machine. Production of the T-34-85 began in early 1944. Soviet factories, already experienced in mass-producing the earlier models, adapted quickly. Within months, Thousands of the new tanks were rolling out of assembly lines. They entered combat during the later stages of the war, just as the Red Army began its massive offensives to liberate Eastern Europe. The first large-scale use of the T-34-85 came during the Battle of Berlin and the final push toward Germany. These tanks led the assault through ruined cities and heavily fortified positions. Although the German Tigers and Panthers remained formidable, the overwhelming number of T-34-85s, combined with Soviet tactical superiority and artillery support, proved decisive. The tank's 85mm gun could engage enemy armor effectively, while its reliability allowed it to operate with minimal maintenance, even in the most demanding conditions. Beyond its firepower, the T-34-85 had an important psychological impact. It restored confidence among Soviet tank crews, who could now face the latest German machines on more equal terms. The morale boost this brought to the Red Army was significant. Commanders described the T-34-85 as a tank that returned initiative to the Soviet soldier. By the end of the war, the T-34-85 had replaced almost all older T-34-76 models on the front lines. Its combination of armor, mobility, and firepower made it one of the most balanced and versatile tanks of World War II. More importantly, it was a machine that could be built in enormous numbers without sacrificing effectiveness, a rare achievement in wartime engineering. The T-34-85 would continue to serve long after the fall of Berlin, becoming a cornerstone of Soviet armored forces for decades. Its design marked the peak of wartime evolution for the T-34 line, a perfect balance between simplicity and lethality, refined through the harsh lessons of combat. By the time the T-34-85 entered the battlefield, in 1944, the Red Army had transformed from a force fighting for survival into one of unstoppable momentum. The once defensive war had become an offensive crusade to reclaim Soviet territory and drive deep into the heart of Germany. At every stage of this journey, from the ruins of Stalingrad to the streets of Berlin, the T-34 was at the center of the action, symbolizing both the strength of Soviet industry and the determination of its soldiers. The turning point came earlier, at Stalingrad, while the T-34-85 was not yet in service. The earlier T-34-76 played a decisive role in the city's defense and eventual Soviet counteroffensive. The tank's mobility allowed Soviet forces to maneuver through the frozen steppes surrounding the city, cutting off German supply lines during the encirclement of the Sixth Army. The victory at Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility and marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet advance westward. As the Red Army pushed the Germans back across the vast Eastern Front, the T-34 became the backbone of every major offensive. In the Battle of Kursk, it helped blunt Germany's last large-scale armored assault. In the liberation of Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, it crushed fortified positions and supported infantry assaults through forests, rivers, and destroyed cities. The tank's wide tracks made it perfectly suited to the harsh terrain, and its ability to keep moving under fire became legendary among both Soviet and German troops. By late 1944, the upgraded T-34-85 gave Soviet armored divisions a crucial advantage. Its gun could now pierce even the thick frontal armor of a Panther or Tiger at close range, and its reliability ensured that massive Soviet offensives could maintain momentum. The Red Army developed a new style of warfare, built around speed and overwhelming force. Waves of T-34s would break through German defenses, followed by mechanized infantry and artillery support. Once a breach was made, Soviet tank columns would pour through and push deep behind enemy lines, surrounding and isolating German formations before they could regroup. This strategy reached its full expression in Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, one of the most successful offensives of the war. Soviet forces annihilated the German Army Group Center, liberating most of Belarus and advancing hundreds of kilometers in just a few weeks. The T-34 was everywhere, crossing rivers, storming bridges, and leading armored spearheads that shattered the German front. The rapid pace of the operation stunned the German command and demonstrated that the Red Army had mastered modern mobile warfare. By early 1945, the road to Berlin lay open. As Soviet forces closed in on the German capital, the T-34-85 led the final push. The fighting in the city was fierce and chaotic, with tanks often engaging enemies at close range between buildings and rubble. The T-34's mobility and compact size allowed it to maneuver through narrow streets where larger tanks like the Tiger struggled. Though losses were heavy, Soviet tank crews pressed forward relentlessly, block by block, until the Red Army reached the Reichstag. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the T-34 stood as one of the defining symbols of victory. It had fought in nearly every major engagement on the Eastern Front, from the desperate defense of 1941 to the triumph of its combination of durability, adaptability, and sheer numbers made it the spearhead of the Soviet advance and one of the most successful tanks in military history. The journey from Stalingrad to Berlin was not just a story of military conquest, but of endurance and innovation. The T-34 had evolved alongside the Red Army itself, from a weapon of survival to a machine of liberation. And as Soviet soldiers raised their flag over Berlin, the silhouette of the T-34, battered and scarred, stood as a testament to the machine that had carried them all the way to victory. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the T-34 had already secured its place in history. It was not only the most produced tank of the war, but also one of the most influential armored vehicles ever built. Its legacy extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe. The T-34 became a symbol of Soviet resilience and industrial strength, and it continued to shape global military history for decades to come. After the war, thousands of T-34s remained in service across the Soviet Union's vast territory. They were simple to maintain, easy to repair, and still effective against most post-war threats. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union distributed the T-34 to its allies and satellite states as part of its growing influence during the early Cold War. These tanks formed the backbone of armored forces in Eastern Europe, Asia, and even parts of Africa and the Middle East. The T-34's reach became global. It was used by nations such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Egypt, and Syria. Many countries produced their own variants under Soviet supervision, even as newer tanks like the T-54 and T-55 replaced it in the Soviet arsenal. The T-34 remained active in countless conflicts around the world. One of the earliest and most notable appearances came during the Korean War, 1950–1953. North Korean forces, equipped with T-34-85s, used them effectively in the opening months of the conflict, overwhelming lightly armed South Korean and U.S. forces. It took time and the arrival of advanced Western tanks like the M-26 Pershing before United Nations forces could neutralize the T-34 threat. This demonstrated that even 5 years after World War II, the T-34 was still a formidable battlefield presence. In later decades, the T-34 appeared in wars across the globe. It saw action in the Middle East, during the Arab-Israeli conflicts, in Vietnam, and in several African civil wars. In many of these cases, it served as both a weapon and a political symbol, a reminder of Soviet support for revolutionary movements. In developing nations, the tank's design philosophy also left a lasting mark on future armored warfare. Soviet engineers learned valuable lessons from the T-34, that a tank should be simple, durable, and easy to mass produce. This thinking directly influenced the next generations of Soviet tanks, including the T-54, T-62, and T-72, all of which carried elements of the T-34's DNA: sloped armor, strong mobility, and rugged engineering. Beyond its technical legacy, the T-34 became a cultural and emotional icon. In the Soviet Union, it was celebrated as the tank of victory, appearing in films, museums, and parades. Many T-34s were preserved as monuments across Europe, Standing on pedestals in cities liberated by the Red Army, they became symbols not just of military might, but of sacrifice and endurance. The machine that had carried an entire nation through its darkest hours to ultimate triumph. Even in the 21st century, the T-34 remains a recognizable symbol of World War II. A few still operate in ceremonial roles, and some even saw combat in minor conflicts. Long after their time should have ended, its silhouette is unmistakable, compact, purposeful, and enduring, a reminder of how one design changed the course of modern warfare. The T-34's legacy lies not only in the battles it won, but in the generations it inspired. It proved that effective engineering, mass production, and human determination could overcome even the most technologically advanced enemy. More than 8 decades after its creation, the T-34 continues to stand as one of history's greatest mechanical achievements. A tank that didn't just win a war, but helped shape the modern world that followed. The story of the T-34 is not just the story of a tank. It is the story of how a single design reshaped the nature of modern warfare and helped decide the fate of nations. When it first appeared in 1941, few could have imagined that this Soviet machine, born from necessity and forged in secrecy, would become one of the most important weapons of the 20th century. Yet by the end of World War II, the T-34 had not only turned the tide on the Eastern Front, but had also redefined what a tank could be. The T-34's impact began with its revolutionary designs. It was the first tank to combine sloped armor, strong firepower, and high mobility in a single balanced package. Before its arrival, most armies treated tanks as specialized tools, some built for speed, others for heavy armor. Few that could do both. The T-34 changed that. It proved that a well-designed medium tank could outperform heavier, more expensive machines by being faster, more reliable, and easier to produce. This philosophy would shape tank development for decades, influencing designs across the world. Its success also demonstrated the power of industrial adaptation. The Soviet Union's ability to relocate its factories, reorganize its workforce, and mass-produce T-34s under constant threat of invasion showed that war could be won not just on the battlefield, but in the factory. Every T-34 that rolled off an assembly line represented a triumph of logistics and willpower over scarcity and destruction. In this sense, the T-34 was as much a symbol of Soviet endurance as it was of military innovation. On the battlefield, the T-34 transformed the Red Army's strategy. It gave Soviet commanders a versatile weapon that could attack, defend, and exploit breakthroughs with equal efficiency. Its mobility allowed deep penetration tactics that trapped and destroyed German armies. In the great battles of Kursk, Stalingrad, and Berlin, the T-34 was not simply a weapon. It was the instrument through which the Soviet Union turned defense into victory. Psychologically, the T-34 became a symbol of hope and defiance. For Soviet soldiers, it embodied strength, reliability, and the belief that victory was possible even in the darkest moments of the war. For the Germans, it was a reminder that their technological superiority could be challenged and overcome by ingenuity, adaptability, and determination. The legacy of the T-34 reaches far beyond the Second World War. It became a foundation upon which post-war armored doctrines were built, both in the East and the West. Every modern main battle tank, from the American M48 to the Soviet T-72, owes part of its lineage to the principles the T-34 established: balanced design, sloped armor, and operational efficiency. Even more profoundly, the T-34's story is a reminder of how human creativity can thrive under pressure. It was conceived during a time of political fear, built under unimaginable hardship, and perfected amid the chaos of total war. Yet from those conditions emerged one of the greatest military innovations in history. In the end, the T-34 changed the course of World War II by giving the Soviet Union the means to survive, recover, and ultimately prevailed. But its influence went further. It changed how nations thought about war, production, and technological progress. It proved that victory does not always belong to the most advanced or expensive machine, but to the one that can endure, adapt, and keep moving forward. Decades after the last battle was fought, the T-34 still stands as a symbol of courage, resilience, and the power of design to shape history. It was more than a tank, it was the steel embodiment of a nation's will and the machine that helped decide the destiny of the modern world.